That's a good thing, yeah. Some of them are so used to running people out of here.
On this Wednesday morning, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley is on Capitol Hill, and she'll be explaining her credentials to be the next UN ambassador. The president-elect's nominee will testify today before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This past week, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham proposed legislation to cut off UN funding unless the UN Security Council reverses a vote condemning Israel for its settlements in Palestine. And she is likely to be asked about that. This is live coverage on C-SPAN 3.
I didn't know if it was the whole family.
Oh, you are?
But I can stay.
Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. We had a few conflicting things happening at 10 o'clock, and so we started at 10:10 to make sure our ranking member could be with us. We have two very distinguished guests with us today from the state of South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Tim Scott. The way the order is going to work today, they will be introducing our outstanding nominee. They're going to say some brief comments. We're going to make some opening comments. As is the norm, I won't question it first. I'll save my time for interjections, and we'll move directly to Senator Cardin. But we welcome our nominee. We welcome our distinguished friends. And with that, Lindsey, if you want to lead off, we'd love to hear from you. It's
well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A great honor to have you here in our committee.
Well, thank you. You're probably the only one who would say that, so I'm having a hard enough time staying on the committees that I'm actually assigned to, so I may drop by more often. John McCain would be real pleased to see me drop by here more often. You're going to hear a personal story that I think is uniquely American. So as Nikki begins to explain who she is, where she come from, and how she got the job she's got, I think you're going to be really proud of our country. And I will not get in the way of that story other than to say it is one of the most compelling stories in American politics, and all of us in South Carolina are proud. As to the UN, I consider myself an internationalist. The chairman has been working on trying to deal with modern slavery. I think the UN is a body that can do a lot of good, but needs to be reformed. Most Americans are losing trust in the body. 20 resolutions against Israel and 6 against the world at large is probably a body that needs to refocus on the world as it really is. I think Governor Haley will talk about her desire to stand up more forcefully for Israel. And I think it's time for America to stand up more forcefully for Israel in the UN. She'll talk about reform. I'm the chairman of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee on Appropriations with Senator Lee. We're in charge of the UN's budget, the State Department's budget. And let me tell you a little bit about the body. PEPFAR and other programs that the UN administers have saved millions of lives. The new Secretary General had a long talk with him a couple of days ago, really encouraged by his vision for the United Nations. He was in charge of refugee programs throughout the world, so he understands the body. He's been out in the field, and I think Nikki Haley and the new Secretary General will form a partnership that will reform a body that's long overdue. And the first thing out of the new Secretary General's mouth was, I intend to reform this body to make you more proud of the way it functions. In that regard, he'll have a good partner in Governor Haley. She's been the governor of our state some of the most difficult times you could imagine. A 1,000-year flood, the massacre of 9 people in a church in Charleston. She's handled some of the most difficult experiences in modern South Carolina with grace, poise, determination, and dignity. Trust me, it has been a tough year or so for South Carolina, and Governor Haley has brought us together and gotten us to places we should have been a long time ago. I think that skill set is exactly what the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations needs. You can learn the details of foreign policy, but you either have the ability to persuade people, you have the ability to transform organizations, or you don't. Now, I've seen her persuade people who have dug in for literally centuries about now's the time to move the Confederate flag. I've seen her bring international business concerns to our state by engaging in a fashion to convince them that of all the places you could do business in the world, South Carolina is where you need to be. Bottom line, America's voice in the United Nations needs to be strong. It needs to be somebody that can bring people together. It needs to be a voice that understands what America is all about. I think Nikki Haley, our governor in South Carolina, is the right person at the right time. She represents a combination of intellect, determination, grace, and an understanding of America that the world needs to hear. I know that if she is the ambassador for our country, the United Nations will be better off, and our country will be in good hands.
Thank you so much. Now we'll turn to Senator Scott, who in his very brief amount of time here has brought great consciousness, I think, to our body and clarity. We thank him for his service, his unique perspective on so many issues that we deal with, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. It certainly is a pleasure for me to be here introducing not only my governor, but my friend who I've gotten to know over many years. And her story really is the epitome of the American dream coming to life. Her parents migrated from India to Canada and then to rural South Carolina back in 1969. Her father, brilliant man, college professor. Her mother, an entrepreneur, started a clothing boutique store where Nikki figured out how to work. Thank her mom for that today. According to my staff, and this is perhaps the most important part of my introduction, she attended a school in upstate South Carolina that in 2015 was the #2 football team in the country, Cory Booker. This year, they were the #1 team. They also are known as the Clemson Tigers, and her daughter is a student at Clemson as well. She learned how to get along with folks. She learned how to study. She learned how to be a student of the things that mattered in life. And over time, that transcended everything that she did. I met Nikki back when I started serving in the South Carolina House of Representatives in 2009. She had already been there. She served 3 terms in the South Carolina House of Representatives. Before she was in the House, she led the local Chamber of Commerce, becoming the president of the National Association of Women Business Owners, and was elected in 2004 to the South Carolina House. I was able to see firsthand the way she embodied the American values in her leadership, something that we all have grown to love and appreciate about her. In 2010, She became the first female governor of South Carolina and only the second in the nation Indian American governor in our nation. Under Governor Haley's leadership, South Carolina's unemployment rate hit a 15-year record low. New jobs in every single county in South Carolina, representing the greatest names in industry, from the Boeings of the world to expansions of the BMWs to the attraction of more investment from Michelin to Bridgestone. Nikki Haley, during her term, created over 82,000 jobs in South Carolina. Nikki is also a champion of transparency and accountability in government, two things that I and many of us hope to see more of at the United Nations. In 2015, as Lindsay's already mentioned, during some of the darkest hours our state has ever known, the Mother Emanuel Massacre, Nikki Haley led not only as a governor, not only as a strong leader, but as a mother, as a human being that was impacted by such an atrocity. She led our state to come together with those types of leadership skills, bringing people together under the worst of times, under the most difficult conditions, is something that she specializes in. The United Nations will be better because Nikki Haley will be a part of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both. I know that you have other business, and you're welcome to go deal with that business, but we thank you for being here. And again, Governor Haley, we thank you for putting yourself forward. We look forward to your comments in just a moment.
Thank you.
The United Nations Security Council United Nations Security Council was created after World War II to create stability and to maintain security in the world. And yet, as we look around the world today, it's failing in its cause of peace and security. We can only look to Syria, where over 500,000 people have been slaughtered, people have been tortured, chemical weapons have been used against people, and yet the United Nations Security Council has been unable to do anything to counter what has happened there. Russia has remade the map by invading Georgia in 2008, again in Ukraine, and yet the United Nations has been unable to deal with that issue. China is violating all kinds of international norms in the South China Sea, and yet the United Nations Security Council is unable to deal with that issue. As a matter of fact, the United Nations Security Council has been unable to deal with the issues that is agreed upon, its own resolutions, whether it's North Korea and the violations that are taking place and the half-hearted efforts that have taken place by members to really push and enforce strong sanctions. In Iran, we have the same issue where an agreement has been reached, and yet Iran continues to violate, especially on ballistic missiles, something that, again, the United Nations Security Council had agreed to. And what it's done instead is continued to pursue anti-Semitic measures. The Permanent Five have two members that actually are causing the world to be less stable, and that is Russia and China. So we've got a built-in issue here where any of those Permanent Five members can veto the actions of the rest and keep the United Nations from rightfully dealing with issues that need to be dealt with. As a matter of fact, the gap between what the United Nations was meant to be and what it's become has never been wider at this moment in time. The U.S. is the largest contributor, 22% of the normal dues. We pay 29% of the peacekeeping dues or participation. We also give billions of dollars to other organizations that are affiliated. And yet we see in the peacekeeping mission violations of sexual exploitation and abuse. And yet, again, it seems no real action. And yet I believe the United Nations can and should play an important role. I believe it is and can play an important role in conflict areas and delivering humanitarian aid. But I think we're at a pivotal point, and that's why I'm excited that our nominee is here today. While our former Secretary General, to me in many cases, for me it was hard to determine if he even had a pulse when big issues were being dealt with by the world. I will say the new UN Secretary General Guterres seems to me to be somebody that really wants the United Nations to do what it was intended to do. I had several very strong conversations with him over the last several days as the United Nations was dealing with some current business. And I have a feeling you're going to have a much better partner when confirmed to this position. I know that Governor Haley is a fierce advocate for U.S. interest. All of us who've met with her in our offices have seen that. I really do believe that she is a person that knows that the United Nations needs tremendous reform and change. And I really believe that we have a right to demand that as the largest contributor, as the greatest country on earth. I think that our nominee will in fact demand that, and I think we'll in fact see very positive changes when she's confirmed. And with that, I turn it over to our distinguished ranking member and my friend, Ben Cardin.
Well, Chairman Corker, thank you for the manner in which this hearing has been arranged. Thank you very much for all the courtesies that you have shown. Governor Haley, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
It's a difficult time to serve in government, and it's a very difficult time to serve at the United Nations and serve on a critically important position for our national security and our global affairs. So we thank you for being willing to step forward to serve your country. I want to thank your husband and son who are here, because this is going to be a family sacrifice. So you're going to have to share your mother and your wife with our country and with the global community, and we thank you for being willing to do that. Chairman Corker, you're correct. In the meeting I had with Governor Haley, it was most impressive to see Governor Haley's passion for U.S. values and her statements as to how she sees the role at the United Nations. I found very encouraging. So I thank you very much for that opportunity. International institutions like the United Nations are under tremendous stress, as the entire liberal international order of the last 7 decades. The United Nations plays a vital role in the maintenance of the current international order, which has served the United States well since 1945. As Ronald Reagan said, we must, in his own words, determine that the UN should succeed and serve the cause of peace for humankind, for the stakes are high. I couldn't agree more with our former president. So we will need a strong, principled voice at the United Nations who is committed to reforming and strengthening it. I firmly believe in a world where America works with our allies and partners, a world that is governed by just laws and institutions, a world where we champion our values, both at home and abroad. And in many ways, the United Nations is the premier international forum to engage in such activities. Much will be said about your experience today, and I am concerned, I must say, about your lack of foreign policy experience, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this hearing. One area where I was particularly impressed with your leadership was when you publicly called for the removal of the Confederate flag from South Carolina's state capitol, an effort that was ultimately successful. Your actions not only demonstrated your willingness to address hate and bigotry, but also your ability to build and work with coalitions, which will be critically important if confirmed to be our United Nations ambassador. It is my hope that your shrewd political sensibility, history of coalition and consensus building, and desire to undertake new challenges will help you in the early weeks and months of your tenure, should you be confirmed. If confirmed, you will lead the fight for American values at the United Nations by standing up against violations of international humanitarian laws, against war crimes, against human rights violations, and against crackdowns on democracy and freedom of speech. You will face complex challenges like today's global humanitarian crisis. People are fleeing their homes on a scale not seen since World War II, all at a time when climate change, food insecurity, and water scarcities are increasing tensions and instability across the globe. These are challenges that cut across borders that the United States alone cannot meet. The United Nations is uniquely placed to address these problems, and we must engage it robustly to advance America's interest. The United Nations and the global community needs U.S. leadership promoting our core values. The United Nations' failings are well known. Less known is what it gets right. Vaccinating 40% of the world's children, assisting more than 55 million refugees fleeing war, famine, and human rights abuses, providing food to 90 million people in 80 countries, and maternal health work that has saved the lives of 30 million women. Many of us have traveled around the world, and we've seen the faces of people who are here today and families that are here today that would not have been but for the work of the United Nations. The United Nations has also launched the Sustainable Development Goals, which, if fully embraced, could have a powerful impact globally on reducing human rights abuses, poverty, and poor governance, in addition to reaching important benchmarks in women and children's health, economic development, and education. I was particularly proud to promote the U.S. leadership on goal number 16, which is special and unprecedented international commitment to improving governance and reducing corruption, which are critically important to U.S. national security interests. The SDGs, as they are known, are extraordinary and ambitious goals that can be achieved in concert with American diplomatic and development efforts. They represent among the best of what the United Nations can do as a convening power. Another dimension of that convening power is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. For 25 years, the nations of the world have come together to try to tackle the most existential of threats to humanity, climate change. There has been substantial attention paid to the Paris Accords, and rightly so. But Governor Haley, I want to know your thoughts about America's larger role in climate diplomacy leadership around the world. The United Nations can and must be more effective in dealing with challenges affecting the world order. U.S. leadership is essential. I don't believe we strengthen the United Nations by enacting across-the-board funding cuts to the United Nations. And yet I do believe we can all agree that the United Nations must do better in many areas. For it to achieve its full potential, it must change. So let me share with you some areas where I hope we can work to reform and change the way the United Nations does its business. First, the United Nations must be fair. One of the persistent weaknesses across the UN system has been its biased and ugly approach to issues related to Israel. This must end. The responsibility for doing so starts with the member states and our ambassador, if confirmed, with your voice. The United States must continue to use its voice and its vote to call out and push back against resolutions and other actions that aim to isolate Israel, our unique ally in the Middle East. I remained deeply disappointed by the UN Security Council's passage of a blatantly one-sided resolution this December, and it's absolutely unacceptable, though telling, that the attendees at that session applauded after Resolution 2334's passage, underscoring the isolation and bias against Israel. Second, Russia's cynical obstructionism in the United Nations Security Council must be addressed. I agree completely with Senator Corker. The war in Syria has resulted in more than 400,000 deaths and the displacement of millions. Russia has vetoed 6 UN Security Council resolutions that could have reduced the violence, further exposing the vulnerability of the international system to Russia's aggression. Atrocities committed in Syria amount to war crimes, and those responsible must be held accountable. That's our role in the international community to make sure that, in fact, takes place. Third, UN peacekeeping must be strengthened. United Nations peacekeepers deployed to conflicts around the world, and as a result, the United States doesn't have to do it alone. UN peacekeepers help end war, protect civilian populations, and secure territory. But troop quality and effectiveness must be increased, and the United Nations must aggressively address sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers. No other issue has so profoundly eroded the trust of local populations or the confidence of the international community. Fourth, the United Nations must reform its internal management through simplification, flexibility, and decentralization. It must focus more on quality and less on process, and on people rather than bureaucracy. It must be committed to building a culture of accountability and protection of whistleblowers. I am confident that the U.S. as a strong partner in reform with the new Secretary General. I agree again with Chairman Corker. I think the Secretary General Guterres presents a strong leader who takes this position with a stronger background than any previous Secretary General of the United Nations. He led the UN Refugee Agency. I urge you to work closely with the new Secretary General in accomplishing the purposes that we need to accomplish. Finally, we must shore up the UN humanitarian response system, which is under extraordinary stress. Brutal conflicts and violent extremism are devastating the lives of millions of people, but the international assistance being provided is not keeping up with the need and scale of the problem. South Sudan is a tragic example of the struggles in the UN and the international systems faced with corrupt, entrenched leaders put their interests and lives ahead of the people, with devastating results. Tens of thousands are dead, millions are being displaced, are hungry and vulnerable. The Security Council members must resolve to use the UN as a platform and a voice to speak up for the people whose voices often go unheard, as well as those working hard on the front line. We must do so not merely because it's the right thing to do. The United States has a profound moral obligation to lead on these issues, but also because it is squarely in our national interest to do this. The United States is better served when we address these issues through the United Nations than to face it alone. For all of its shortcoming, and more importantly, for all the unsung good that it does, it's almost impossible to imagine a world without the UN. For 70 years, it's where the world has come together to reaffirm norms and values and work through the most pressing shared challenges facing humanity. Our national security is strengthened when we are at the table at the United Nations, and the United Nations is more effective when American leadership and values are on display. In a time where the world is in turmoil, it is interest of the American people from the United States to support and maintain cultural alliances and institutions that create stability are more important today than ever before. We've already seen that instability and unrest bringing a crisis to our own doors. In addition to the United Nations, there should be little debate about the essential role of the Euro-Atlantic institutions in maintaining peace and security in Europe and elsewhere since the end of World War II. In the 20th century, Europe has been divided by wars and rivalries. Today, Europe faces its challenges, but the progress in creating a stable and free Europe through such institutions as NATO, the EU, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has contributed immeasurably to European peace, stability, and prosperity, and to the American strength, well-being, and leadership in the world as well. The vitality and endurance of these institutions serve the interests of the United States. So let me just mention one last point. I was particularly disturbed by President-elect Trump's comments over the weekend about NATO as being obsolete, repeating a statement that he had made earlier. Vladimir Putin wishes it were, but it's not. So I'm anxious to hear your views, Governor Haley, on NATO, on the importance of our alliances. We need to be reassuring our allies, not threatening to abandon them. With a strong and sustained U.S. leadership, the United Nations will continue to be the indispensable force for a better world. America's ambassador to the UN is essential to that effort. Governor Haley, I look forward to hearing from you today and learning more about your vision as to how the United Nations can better serve the international community.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. As I listen to your analysis of the United Nations, much of which I agree to, I know that being the United Nations ambassador is really more about reform and causing something that is dysfunctional to function. And in many ways, having a governor with your energies could well be, again, a very inspired choice. I know you have a number of family members here. I've noticed members always treat nominees with much greater kindness when their family members are with them. If you would like to introduce them, you're welcome to do so. We look forward to your opening comments and questions. Again, thank you for being willing to serve in this capacity.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Cardin, for your comments, and I certainly look forward to discussing all of those things with you and the rest of the committee. I do have my family behind me because I've never been able to do anything without the support of my family. And so to my left, I have my favorite younger brother, Gogi Rendawa, who owns his own business and is an entrepreneur. I have my parents, Dr. and Mrs. Rendawa, who reminded my brothers, my sister, and me every day how blessed we were to live in this country. I have my amazing husband, but also the coolest first man ever. But he is also a combat veteran. Michael is behind me, and next to him is one of my pride and joy kids, and that's Naylan, who is wearing a suit today, which he would prefer not wearing, but he does have his basketball shoes on. So I pick and choose my battles as a mom. I have my in-laws, Bill and Carol Haley, who have been an amazing support to me and a second set of parents to us as we've gone through struggles. And then I have my favorite older brother, Mitty Rendau, who's also a combat veteran, and his wife, Sonia. And then I have lots of friends behind them as well. And so I told them if I started to mess up, one of them needed to act like a protester. So we will see if that happens.
I think she's going to do very well at the United Nations.
So with that, I would like to say, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, distinguished members of the committee, I come before you today both humbled and honored to be considered to represent the United States of America at the United Nations. Just as other nominees for this position have done, I am here to outline my vision and discuss my qualifications. My story is an American story. I was born in Bamberg, South Carolina, the daughter of immigrant parents from Punjab, India. My parents had comfortable lives in India, but they chose to give up those comforts and move to America with just $8 in their pockets because of the freedoms and the opportunities this country offers. Our family's experience is unique, but it is also familiar because it is one that has been repeated many times by many people in American history. Growing up in a small rural community in the South, our family was different. We were not white enough to be white. We were not black enough to be black. My father wore a turban. My mother wore a sari. Our new neighbors didn't quite know what to make of us. So we did face challenges, but those challenges paled next to the abundance of opportunities in front of us. My dad was a professor at a small historically black college. My mom was a social studies teacher and started a clothing store from scratch. I started doing the books for the family business when I was 13. It wasn't until I got to college that I realized that wasn't normal. But it was normal to me. In my family, we worked. I was also privileged to take advantage of the educational opportunities that America affords, and I am painfully aware that the chance for 13-year-old girls to read and learn and grow is something that does not exist in far too many places around the world today. I went on to serve in South Carolina General Assembly and to be elected and re-elected governor of the Palmetto State. Serving the people of South Carolina has been the greatest honor of my life. During the 6 years of my governorship, our state has faced many challenges, but South Carolina today is stronger economically and more united culturally than it has ever been before, and I couldn't be more proud. While South Carolina will always be my home, I am eager to begin this new chapter. International diplomacy is a new area for me. There is much I am learning about the intricacies of the UN and its associated agencies. I don't claim that I know everything or that leadership at the UN is the same as leading South Carolina. But diplomacy itself is not new to me. In fact, I would suggest there is nothing more important to a governor's success than her ability to unite those with different backgrounds, viewpoints, and objectives behind a common purpose. For 6 years, that has been my work, day after day, in times of celebration and in times of great tragedy. I have negotiated deals with some of the largest corporations in the world and convinced them to make South Carolina their home. I have been the chief executive of a government with more than 67,000 employees and an annual budget of more than $26 billion, and we have achieved real results. South Carolina is a different, stronger, better place than it was 6 years ago. Like most government agencies, the United Nations could benefit from a fresh set of eyes. I will take an outsider's look at the institution As I have in every challenge in my life, I will come to the UN to work and to work smart. I will bring a firm message to the UN that U.S. leadership is essential to the world. It is essential for the advancement of humanitarian goals and for the advancement of America's national interests. When America fails to lead, the world becomes a dangerous place. And when the world becomes more dangerous, the American people become more vulnerable. At the UN, as elsewhere, the United States is the indispensable voice of freedom. It is time that we once again find that voice. The job of UN ambassador is different from being governor, but there is one essential element of leadership that is the same, and that is accountability. A leader must be accountable to the people she serves. Should you confirm me as ambassador, I will be accountable, first and foremost, to the people of the United States. Mr. Chairman, accountability means being honest with ourselves. As I appear before you today, when we look at the United Nations, we see a checkered history. The UN and its specialized agencies have had numerous successes. Its health and food programs have saved millions of lives. Its weapons monitoring efforts have provided us with vital security information. Its peacekeeping missions have, at times, performed valuable services. However, any honest assessment also finds an institution that is often at odds with the American national interests and American taxpayers. Nowhere has the UN's failure been more consistent and more outrageous than its bias against our close ally, Israel. In the General Assembly session just completed, the UN adopted 20 resolutions against Israel and only 6 targeting the rest of the world's countries combined. In the past 10 years, the Human Rights Council has passed 62 resolutions condemning the reasonable actions Israel takes to defend its security. Meanwhile, the world's worst human rights abusers in Syria, Iran, and North Korea received far fewer condemnations. This cannot continue. It is in this context that the events of December 23rd were so damaging. Last month's passage of UN Resolution 2334 was a terrible mistake, making a peace agreement with the Israelis and the Palestinians even harder to achieve. The mistake was compounded by the location in which it took place, in light of the UN's long history of anti-Israel bias. I was the first governor in America to sign legislation combating the anti-Israel boycott, divest, and sanctions, or the BDS movement. I will not go to New York and abstain when the UN seeks to create an international environment that encourages boycotts of Israel. In fact, I pledge to you this: I will never abstain when the United Nations takes any action that comes in direct conflict with the interests and values of the United States. In the matter of human rights, Mr. Chairman, whether it's the love of my families and America's immigrant heritage, or the removal of a painful symbol of an oppressive past in South Carolina, I have a clear understanding that it is not acceptable to stay silent when our values are challenged. I will be a strong voice for American principles and American interests, even if that is not what other UN representatives want to hear. The time has come for American strength once again. There are other elements of accountability as well. As governor, the South Carolina Constitution required me to report annually to the people of my state on how their security and prosperity were being advanced by their government. In fact, I gave that State of the State address just 1 week ago. I was able to tell the citizens of South Carolina that we now invest more dollars in public education than ever before, that our reserves have doubled while our debt service has been cut in half, and more South Carolinians are working today than ever in the history of our state. Without fundamental changes at the UN, I cannot envision making the same kind of report to the American people as their ambassador. We contribute 22% of the UN's budget, far more than any other country. We are a generous nation, but we must ask ourselves, What good is being accomplished by this disproportionate contribution? Are we getting what we pay for? To your credit, the Congress has already begun to explore ways the United States can use its leverage to make the United Nations a better investment for the American people. I applaud your efforts, and I look forward to working with you to bring seriously needed change to the UN. If I am confirmed, I will need you, and I hope to have your support. In short, Mr. Chairman, my goal for the United Nations will be to create an international body that better serves the interests of the American people. After the passage of the infamous UN resolution equating Zionism with racism in 1975, U.S. Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan came to the unsettling realization that, as he put it, quote, "If there were no General Assembly, this could never have happened." Today, over 40 years later, more and more Americans are becoming convinced by actions like the passage of Resolution 2334 that the United Nations does more harm than good. The American people see the UN's mistreatment of Israel, its failure to prevent the North Korean nuclear threat, its waste and corruption, and they are fed up. My job, our job, is to reform the UN in ways that will rebuild the confidence of the American people. We must build an international institution that honors America's commitment to freedom, democracy, and human rights. I hope this can be done. I believe it is possible. And I know that if you confirm me, I will do all I can to see that that happens. Some say we live in cynical and distrustful times, but I believe we all carry in our hearts a bit of idealism that animated the creation of the United Nations. I know I do. With your blessing, I will represent our great country in this international forum. I will do it in ways that I hope bring honor to our country, our values, and our national interests. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for those comments. We'll begin a 7-minute round, including answers from the nominee, and we'll start with Senator Cardin and go to Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Haley, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I find it very encouraging, very refreshing. You have hit points that I strongly agree with about being, when you say it's clear understanding that it's not acceptable to stay silent when our values are challenged. You indicated that to me when we were together in my office. Your point about America being the indispensable voice of freedom. So I'm very encouraged by your statement. So let me get specific, if I might, and talk a little bit about Russia. Russia certainly has not been a voice for freedom under President Putin. A free country has free and fair elections and doesn't interfere with other countries' free and fair elections. Russia has not only interfered with our elections, they're interfering with other elections, including in Europe. A country that believes in freedom allows civil societies to function, allows opposition a fair opportunity. Mr. Putin imprisons his opponents and kills them if need be. A free country does not invade another country and take over territory. Russia has invaded not just Ukraine, but is in Georgia and Moldova and other countries. So my first question to you, speaking, when you say that you will, that staying silent is not an option, speak to me about Mr. Putin and Russia.
Well, thank you, Senator Cardin, for that question. And I think that Russia is going to continue to be at the forefront of a lot of issues that we have to deal with. What I'll tell you is Russia is trying to show their muscle right now. It is what they do. And I think we always have to be cautious. I don't think that we can trust them. I think that we have to make sure that we try and see what we can get from them before we give to them. They certainly have done some terrible atrocities when you look at things in Syria and how they are working with Iran. And I think that we have to continue to be very strong back and show them what this new administration is going to be. And it is going to be an America that shows exactly where we stand, what we are for, what we are against, and how we're going to proceed. And I think that we need to let them know we are not okay with what happened in Ukraine and Crimea and what is happening in Syria. But we're also going to tell them that we do need their help with ISIS and with some other threats that we all share, that we have to move forward.
Does Russia have legitimacy in Crimea?
I don't think that, I think what we saw with Crimea and Ukraine is a big concern, because I think it is Russia trying to make sure that they are inserting themselves in places that they want to continue to insert themselves. The problem is there is no boundaries with Russia. They don't have boundaries. They consider that whatever they want, they will. It's the same thing with NATO. They don't want to see NATO become stronger or more powerful.
But EU and the United States have made it clear they will never recognize Russia's incursion into Crimea. Do you agree that Crimea is Ukraine, it's not Russia?
I do, and I think that we have to make that very clear to them, and I think that's what we have to show is our disappointment in those things.
And talk to me a little bit about, we have sanctions currently against Russia.
We do.
We've been able to get Europe to go along with those sanctions.
Yes.
You agree that those sanctions should not be at all reduced or eliminated until Russia complies with the Minsk agreement?
I think that Russia has to have positive actions before we lift any sanctions on Russia.
Some of us have filed legislation to strengthen the sanction regime against Russia, giving additional tools, additional power to impose additional sanctions. Do you support additional sanctions if Russia does not change its behavior?
I think that what I do believe is important is that we get together with the National Security Council and the President-elect, and we decide a plan for Russia, what we expect from them, what we plan on looking at as we go forward, what violations will trigger additional sanctions, and when we say it, we should do it and follow through with it.
The Philippines have been an ally of us for a long time. Under their current president, they have sanctioned extrajudicial killings. People have been killed that have not gone through court proceedings because of their suspected of using drugs. Do you agree that that violates basic human rights?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
The President Duarte of Philippines has sanctioned extrajudicial killings.
Right.
Does that violate basic human rights?
It does, yes.
And you're prepared to speak up about that in the United Nations?
Yes, I am. I'm prepared to speak up on anything that goes against American values. And the American values is something that we should talk loudly about all the time to all countries, because I think it's the values that we hold dear, and it is at the core of what the United States American heart is all about. We have always been the moral compass of the world, and we need to continue to act out and vocalize that as we go forward.
I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goal 16, good governance. I've talked to you about expanding that so that the United States leadership in good governance fighting corruption, we use the model that we've used in regards to fighting modern-day slavery and trafficking. Will you work with us and in your role in the United Nations to strengthen the U.S. role in fighting corruption globally?
Absolutely. I think that's who we are as Americans, and I think that's what we need to do to make sure that we continue to fight corruption, because if we fight corruption, we will move closer to peace.
There has been some suggestion of a national registry for subgroups of Americans. It's been talked about in regards to Muslim Americans that perhaps there should be a registry. Can you just tell us your view as to whether it's acceptable to have a registry for subgroups of Americans?
Thank you, Senator Cardin, for that question, because I think it goes to maybe some discussions that had been had by President-elect Trump early on. And this administration and I don't think there should be any registry based on religion. I think what we do need to do is make sure that we know exactly which countries are a threat, which ones have terrorism, and those are the ones that we need to watch and be careful and vet as we go forward in terms of who comes into the country.
I understand vetting people who come to America. I'm talking about American citizens. Is there any justification for any registry of subgroups of Americans?
No, there is not.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Jim.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Governor Haley, welcome.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for your willingness to serve. Testimony from your state senators outlined in your own testimony here. You've been a very effective leader in South Carolina, so you're obviously going to be leaving a state you love, a job you've performed well in, taking on a pretty significant challenge. It's striking, quite honestly, to listen to the chairman lay out point by point how ineffective the UN has been, how Ranking Member Cardin says that the UN must change. It must be fair. People must be held accountable. In your testimony, you point out going back 40 years. Then Ambassador Daniel Patrick-Moynihan said if there were no General Assembly, this could never happen. So you're taking on a challenge here to reform a UN that has been unreformable. Do you have a game plan for doing so?
It is what I've done all my life. I love to fix things, and I see a UN that can absolutely be fixed. There are reforms that need to be taken place in a lot of different areas. There are things that the UN does well, and we talked about the Food and Health Organizations, what they've done with the AIDS epidemic. All of those things have been very good, but we do have to look at certain issues. If you look at we have 16 peacekeeping operations. Some are very successful, some are not. And we need to go back and look at when we get into a mission, what is the end goal? Is it happening? Do we need to shift and do things differently, or do we need to pull out? You look at Sierra Leone and you see it started off rocky, but it ended up very strong. If we look at South Sudan, it's terrible. But you also have to look that we're not getting cooperation from their own government. And that requires us to go back and look at that and see what can be salvaged from that. So I see peacekeeping reform from the standpoint of not just those issues, also when it comes to the whistleblower issues. We've seen fraud, we've seen sexual exploitation, we've seen corruption of all kinds, and the whistleblower protections are not strong enough. People are still too afraid to speak up. We need to make sure that the countries that are contributing troops hold those troops accountable when they go and they make these violations. That's not happening. And they need to understand that if we have to pull out their country's troops altogether, we will do that, because many of those countries actually make money off of the peacekeeping missions. And so I do see lots of areas of reform that need to happen, but that is where I thrive. That is what I look forward to, is making real change at the UN.
So to a certain extent, what you're describing is shining